Okay, so I just want to begin by sharing the image that appears on the cover of the book and saying a little bit about this image and why I chose it. So it's from a painting by Alexandre Louis Leloir, who is not, I imagine, a name that you'll be particularly familiar with. He was a mid-19th century French painter. He was actually a contemporary of some of the early Impressionists. And in fact, he painted this painting in 1865, which was only 9 years before the first Impressionist exhibition. But as you'll be able to tell, even probably from the slightly grainy image that you may be able to see, he himself was part of the salon against which the Impressionists rebelled. And so in terms of art history now, he's very much a footnote. But I love this painting. I think it's terrific. And I was particularly delighted when I came across it because it's peculiarly apposite, I think, for this book for a number of reasons that I'll just share with you briefly, if I may. The first is that Howard Jacobson, among the many hats that he wears, one of them is occasionally art critic, and he's a rather fine art critic. He presented as part of a BBC series called The Genius of British Art, which was broadcast in 2010. He presented the third episode in that series, which was devoted to the subject of flesh. And in it, he gave a very powerful, characteristically eloquent defense of a number of English Victorian painters who've fallen rather out of fashion, but who loved to paint flesh in a very sensual way. William Etty, perhaps, is the one that I think the one that Howard focused on primarily, and a name that some of you may be familiar with. So I kind of thought this painting chimed in rather nicely with that enthusiasm of Howard's. The subject of the painting is also important here. It's Jacob wrestling with the angel, and that subject is pertinent for a number of reasons. One is, of course, that it contains a subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, allusion to Jacobson's own surname. More importantly, the subject of the painting, it's taken from a rather strange incident in Genesis, in which Jacob is visited by a man who won't reveal his identity, but who wrestles with him throughout the night until daybreak. Until daybreak is the phrase that's used, at least in the translation that I looked at. Before finally bestowing his blessing on Jacob and renaming him Israel, which means contends with God. Now, Jacobson has invoked this enigmatic episode on a number of occasions in a number of different interviews, both as a metaphor for the writer's struggle to create, as in this quotation that I've put on this slide, silence is the angel with which literature wrestles. So both as a metaphor for the artist's process of creation, but also for the process of reading, for the reader's struggle to contend with the imagination of the writer. So I really liked that dual kind of use to which Jacobson has put this this story, and so that was another reason why I really wanted to have this cover for the book. Finally, last but not least, the way in which Leloir paints this scene, and I don't know, again, I'm not sure how much you'll be able to see because of the limitations of pixels and screens and so on, but I hope you can get some sense of the way in which he has painted not just the sensuality of the flesh, which I've mentioned earlier, but also the ambiguity of the posture of the two men, or the man and the angel, which allows, I think, for the possibility that they are not just striving for physical mastery, but also grappling erotically. And that ambiguity anticipates one of the central arguments of my book, which is that Jacobson's representation of masculinity and male desire is more complex and less heteronormative than has been generally acknowledged by reviewers and critics up till now. More generally, my book celebrates the ambiguities of Jacobson's work, the various ways in which it argues with itself. And so in that sense too, I think this cover image represents the spirit both of Jacobson's work and also, I hope, of my approach to that work. So while we're all familiar with the adage that you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, I suppose I'm saying I'd be quite happy to make an exception in this case, and for people indeed to take the cover as a kind of indication of what lies within the pages. Okay, so I just want to talk briefly about one more aspect of the book, and that is just to give you an overview of its contents. So I've reproduced the contents page of the book here. And what I particularly wanted to just say a few words about was, what was the biggest challenge for me in writing the book, which was trying to arrive at a way of structuring it. So my remit was to cover all of Jacobson's fiction. That's the remit of all the books in the series, Contemporary British Authors, that Manchester University Press published, and that this book is one volume in that series. So the kind of tempting thing, the easiest thing I think would have been to tackle Jacobson's oeuvre chronologically, starting with the first novel, ending with the most recent. But I'm kind of instinctively resistant to that approach. I tend to gravitate towards thematic structures. That was true of the book that I published on Roth, for example. That's the only other single author monograph that I published. But in general, when I'm reading other people's books as well, I tend to prefer the thematic structure because it allows one to identify patterns and connections and to explore recurring preoccupations right across a body of work, irrespective of period. The problem with the thematic approach is that I thought it was important to convey some sense of the evolution of Jacobson as a writer over the course of his career, his development as a novelist. So in the end, I arrived at a thematic structure that does contain a strong element of chronology. So I divided Jacobson's work into three phases. The early phase, as I call it, which I characterize as being particularly centered on his use of comedy, on Jacobson as a comic novelist. And then a middle phase, which I think is very much preoccupied with questions of masculinity and mortality and sexual politics, as you can see there, and a final phase, which may turn out not to be the final phase, of course. I hope it doesn't turn out to be that, because of course Jacobson, thankfully, is still with us and still writing. But at this stage, the final phase of his career, which I think has seen a turn towards more and more explicit explorations of what it means to be Jewish, of Jewishness in all senses of that term. And I was particularly interested in his treatment of anti-Semitism, of the Holocaust, and his intertextual relationship with Philip Roth when I was thinking about that. Obviously, these phases are kind of not mutually exclusive, and many of the novels could have found their way into at least two, if not all three of the categories. But it gave me a useful kind of structure to follow. So in the first chapter, and I should say that I got these chapter titles from an essay that Jacobson published on David Mamet, the American playwright, in which he talks about a panel that the two of them took part in, a panel discussion. And he identifies the topics, the agenda, as it were, for that panel as being funny, being men, and being Jewish. So that was, again, quite a nice discovery for me. It gave me the kind of these useful labels, these useful categories. So in the first chapter, I focus primarily on Jacobson's first three novels, Coming From Behind, Peeping Tom, and Redback, but also two later ones, Zoo Time and Pussy. Pussy is Jacobson's satirical novel on Donald Trump. So although that's quite a recent book, 2017, I put it in that first chapter because I think it's very much part of the kind of satirical tradition of literature. It very much participates in that, albeit in slightly different ways from the ways in which his earliest novels do. In Being Men, that chapter focuses on the very model of a man, No More Mr. Nice Guy, Who's Sorry Now, The Making of Henry, and The Act of Love, which are all middle phase Jacobson novels. But also I include in that chapter his most recent novel, Live a Little, because again, that has a really interesting and quite radical, I think, kind of deconstruction of conventional ideas of masculinity. And in that final chapter, Being Jewish, that chapter focuses on the Finkler question, Jacobson's Man Booker-winning novel, on Jay, and on Shylock Is My Name, which is his rewriting of The Merchant of Venice. So those three are all kind of late novels, but I also include two earlier ones, two from the middle phase, The Mighty Waltzer and Kaluki Nights, because again, they're very self-consciously novels that very self-consciously deal with questions of Jewishness. So I hope that just gives you some flavor of the approach that I take in the book. I'm just going to finish by, well, with a shameless plug, really, which is to let you know that Manchester University Press have very kindly provided us with a discount code, which you can see up on that slide, I hope. And if you buy the book from their website and you apply that code as you check out, it will automatically take 50% off the cover price. And that code expires on 31st March. So there's still time